Sorry for the delay. So, as you can see from my, first of all, thanks for the invitation to the organizers. What I'm going to present is more kind of preliminary work. It's not based on a paper. I will also not talk about deep neural networks. The systems I'm looking at, actually, I don't think they use those. It's basically an optimizers that they use. But anyway, my focus is on automated research. And so my background is in biochemistry, and I moved to philosophy of science. And a lot of my work, I'm interested in basically the laboratory space in the life sciences. I'm interested in how trustworthy, reliable knowledge is generated in such a setting. And I look at like questions of replication, experimental controls, what are questionable research practices, these kind of terms. And when you look at the laboratory space, inevitably you come across automation. And so these two pictures, I chose them because they look obviously quite similar as a single person sitting at a bench or some sort of interface, and there's lots of machineries and kind of stuff. But I think there's a really, also there's a really important shift happening, potentially at least, between these two different settings. And so my general interest is just really trying to understand the various impacts methodologically, epistemologically of automation on laboratory-based science or research. More specifically, I'm interested in what forms does this automation take, and are these differences relevant? And then kind of stepping out of that specific cases to try and think about what kind of framing, conceptual framework might be best suited, most fruitful to identify and address challenges that come along with this switch to more automated programs. And so what I want to do today is first I want to ask how some, not all obviously, how some philosophers of science and philosophers of AI frame the automation question in science. And I want to claim that there's often a narrow focus, or we can find a narrow focus where automation is treated as just the use of AI, and that the framing that is used is what I will clumsily label as the atomistic I frame. Then I want to look at automation in practice, and I will just use the term automation plus, but we could use other terms. I'll comment on that later. And then I basically want to see like how are these two coming together or not together? Where might there be friction points? And then in the last step, because my conclusion is it's maybe a trivial point, because if you're not as narrow as before, blah blah blah, you need a broader lens, so a different framing. But I think it's not just that we need like a quantitative shift to kind of including more if automation is more complex, but also a qualitative shift to kind of a different type of framework. And so I would say we need a relational systems level framing. And I'll try and explain or point to what that might look like. So that's the rough plan. And I hope that's generative or helpful if you observe me trying to think through these things. Okay, so how are some philosophers framing the question? And I think for me, a starting point was this particular book here, edited by Marta Bertolazzo and Fabio Sterpetti, A Critical Reflection on Automated Science. And you can see, will science remain human? And there's some interesting articles in there. I haven't read all the chapters, but those that read, like one is first by Paul Humphreys, Why We Should Cautiously Welcome Automated Science. Sandy Mitchell also has a chapter in there where she reflects on, again, deep neural networks in her case, and compares them, takes the instrumental stance on those systems. And one thing that was interesting to me is that in these cases, automated science is really just seen as AI in science. So it's very like they talk like, here's the challenge of automated science, and then discuss just like, okay, we have AI in science, and specifically usually deep neural networks. But the main issue then is the opacity of some of the machine learning, like using AI and machine learning interchangeably, even if that's a question, just for the moment. And then the question asked is, okay, if we have this opacity that's being injected, do we have new challenges here? And if so, do they matter? Can we deal with that? And so the answer that Sandy Mitchell is giving is that there's no new problem. She says, I would suggest that the same norms that govern our judgments of instrumental reliability in science should be used to warrant the use of AI. And the way she moves forward here is, first of all, the observation, okay, we have many opaque elements in science anyway, and particularly certain instruments. So she takes an instrumental stance, and her example is NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, that's being used to decipher the three-dimensional fold of proteins. And clearly they don't look familiar. It looks more like a spaceship. It's not like a microscope. I love that they use the birch wood to give it an organic sense or whatever, but that's different about laboratory setups, but you can't really, I mean, this is, even as a setup, it's kind of okay. But the point that Mitchell is making is, okay, so these systems, they detect things that humans cannot see. They have an alien sense. Yeah, we cannot see atoms, and they detect the kind of the relaxation of spin of certain nuclei, and it's kind of, that's just something we cannot detect, and the way in which they see these things is alien to us as well. So they get we get certain data of these machines and end up with these protein structure that we try to infer from our data. And so she discusses that this is opaque in different ways. And we have somehow ways of dealing with this, because she said we make warranted use of these instruments. We judge their reliability based on certain norms that we've implemented. And she discusses the norms, and there are three different ones: robust theory and stable data, both over time, but also convergence. It doesn't really matter the details too much, but she says we have these norms or principles. Then she makes a step that AI can be seen as just another instrument. So in her case, she said it's not an extension of the eye, but our cognitive abilities. And then if the similarity is strong enough, she says these norms just transfer also to AI. So the identity function works there. It's just kind of yes. And so there's no new problem. We can use AI like any other something. And obviously, a lot of the work in her argument, if that is her argument properly reconstructed, happens in these two steps. And there's a ton of questions you can ask here. You could ask whether these three norms or principles are these really the ones that have been used, or for other instruments we have more norms. Bringing Alan Franklin, other people had more kind of norms they would apply to kind of judge reliability of experimental output, for instance. So descriptively correct. And then obviously, you could challenge the analogy that she draws. Is it really an instrument? What type of instrument? Is the opaqueness the same? Because if that breaks down, her account is in trouble as well. And Eamon, for instance, he doesn't reply to this particular paper as far as I remember, but he does kind of a similar analysis of maybe how can we know that we can use AI despite its opaqueness in sort of establish its reliability, or establish trust in its reliability. And so he, for instance, then brings in more nuance, and he distinguishes between physically mediated and theoretically mediated instruments. And so in his account, actually, he would say, it's actually a really nice reply, basically, because Mitchell treats it as a causal detection instrument, and Eamon says, this is a different thing. And if we think about a machine learning system, it's a different type of instrument. And in that case, there is actually a new problem, and that generates new work for philosophy of science. So it's interesting. It's not detrimental, but we need to do different things. Anyway, contrasting positions, that's fine. I'm actually not so much interested at this point in kind of who's right. I tend to aim inside, but still, what I'm interested in is kind of within this debate, just because Mitchell and that book in general kind of just frames it in a very particular way. I was like, okay, what is actually this whole debate? If this is a whole debate, 2 pages, but you know what I mean? And this type of thinking, what does it entail? And I think, so this very specific focus on AI and machine learning, deep neural networks, usually, fair enough. But it comes with a specific framing, I think, which is quite very much, you have the person X, Y, that uses tool Y to gain information or to undergo a discovery process or whatever that is. And then there comes the question, does tool Y, for instance, have the right properties for this process to succeed? Oh, it's opaque, so we need to fix that why. We need to get explainable AI, an additional model to help that thing or whatever it is to make process A work better. And so I think, and you know, this is just me reading into it, maybe unfairly, I'm not sure, but I think for me, there is at least a sense that there's an atomistic approach at work here. I think it's person X is its thing with its ways of doing stuff, its internal capabilities, and 2Y is this independent thing with its distinct set of intrinsic properties. It's not relational in any sense. And I think the whole framing is also set up on an individual frame, on the I frame, where problems and solutions are formulated at individual level rather than a systems level or an S frame. So the question here is that particular to Y opaque, and then what can we do? Okay, so that's a very rough characterization of how some authors might approach AI in science. Now I want to switch gears and go to practice. And I mean, the most popular example, and this wasn't out when Sandy Mitchell, for instance, wrote her paper because it's based on a conference that was in 2018, and AlphaFold was maybe just about entering the CAS competition, but it wasn't out or published. But obviously, protein structure prediction has been automated in that sense. We don't really have to take the protein sequence, express it in a bacterium or whatever expression system, purify it, put it into an NMR or an X-ray, and then try and get the data to produce a structure. But they basically put it into AlphaFold, or DeepMind does it for them. But anyway, so this is clearly an automation process, and you know, I just Googled, so this is what the New York Times used, like, you know, said person X and correctly tool Y, apparently that is AlphaFold running on, but I couldn't tell, but anyway, on the screen. And so we have that situation here. I think probably most researchers actually don't interact with AlphaFold. I think they go to the AlphaFold database, which DeepMind describes as like the Google search for protein structures. It's really neat. You don't need any logins. So I put in actually the name of a protein that I worked with. Screenshot is actually not of that protein, something else I looked at, but you can like this visualizer. It's extremely good. You can like rotate it, zoom in, zoom out, just like literally at the click of a button. But in this case, you're really just looking at a database that DeepMind generated with the EMBL EBI, the European Bioinformatics Institute. And so this is really just a resource. You can obviously have direct interaction, so the user can run their sequence on AlphaFold, for instance, via Google Colab. But in this case, like this model is fixed, yeah, like it's been trained, and then you got version 2.3.2 or whatever. And I think in this case, this is probably, you know, a tool-like use or as an instrument. Fair enough. But we have obviously other forms of automation in science, and one that we had for many decades, centuries, is mechanization. And so here you have like a pipetting robot. It's a Hamilton. It's about 30 years old, this particular one, and you can see there's like a liquid reservoir, and then this is all pre-programmed. So you just tell the system how many microliters of which liquid to put into which hole and so on. On the other side, we have a biorad fraction collection. So this is from chromatography, where just have a constant drip. And rather than having a student there collecting all the drips, it just, you can set it to like 1 ml and it will rotate. So this is automation in terms of automotor self-moving. So once you set it in motion, it will just move. But it's in many ways a dumb system. It doesn't set up the rules itself and so on. It's all pre-programmed and preset. Fair enough. So that's one form of automation. Now, obviously, we see much more the move from mechanization to something else, for instance, robot science. And so here, and this brings me back to the picture I had at the beginning. So this is Eve, robot scientist. So Eve is not the person sitting on the right, but it's kind of the, well, the whole box machinery on the left. Has 2 mechanized computer-controlled arms, has a lot of machinery, which is also human-used in some cases. And this system can be used to grow yeast cells, measure growth curves, so just monitor how dense they grow. So it's a simple optical density measurement. And extract curves from that and infer from that how well they're growing comparatively, like different strains. So this has been used to screen a library of drugs, and kind of they created a very neat yeast system which basically has a malaria parasite enzyme that's becoming resistant to drugs, basically. And so if you block that, if you find a drug that blocks that enzyme, the yeast cell doesn't grow as well. And so you can kind of just screen and can see, and they use some sort of active learning in there, which I'm still trying to understand how much active learning there was. It's a bit, but anyway. So that's one system. Then one which I think is really impressive is Maholo LabDroid. So this was first published, so this is from 2015. Maholo LabDroid was first published in 2017. It comes out of the Robotics Biology Institute, like RBI, something like that, in Japan. And Maholo has basically a central body, a torso, and then again 2 arms. But Maholo can actually grow human cells, so but human cells, and induce pluripotent stem cells, which are super tricky to cultivate because they can differentiate and need to be small variations in handling, or that can set them up into a particular path. So it's really difficult to handle. You can see like these 6 well plates, and you need to get the medium off, and so this can actually really stably culture these cells and put them into the condition where they differentiate. And Maholo used the Bayesian optimizer with I think 7 parameters to optimize differentiation of these induced pluripotent stem cells. So a very impressive system. Just another picture to just show the similarity. This is obviously, zoomed in. This here is Maholo in the background. So again, you see the human interface, the kill switch button that you have there as well. So again, it's this more holistic setting. And I think when I look at this, I think part of the thing that's interesting here is obviously Maholo, or also Eve, can constantly gathering new data and using that to update their models. Yeah, so their surrogate model, they are updating it after a round of experimentation. So in that sense, I use the term AI active. It's not a fixed model that's just sitting there. It's constantly updating itself based on its inputs that it gathers. And it's a combination of this learning AI with a mechanization component and different sensors that also feed back into the system. And so there's interaction with the environment, with tools and materials, but also the human, and the system learns from these actions and interactions. And yeah, to me, I mean, you see here this, like you go from mechanical automation to a computational automation process to kind of the automation plus setting that I'm interested in. Obviously, automation plus is about more than computing power or new algorithms. I assume it's a form of embodied AI. I think there's many different definitions in there, but I guess it could be called, under some definitions that you find, an element of embodied AI. So maybe this is what I'm interested in, the challenge of embodied AI, I'm not sure. The automation plus setting, some call it also self-driving laboratories, is seen by many researchers as like kind of the next step for scientific discovery. And I think what's interesting here in this next step is that we have 2 learning agents that interact physically. There are other robot scientists, or whatever you want to call them, which are actually mobile. So there's the mobile robotic chemist, actually moves around and like uses human use systems as well, but it will learn from placements. So even the human could interfere with how it's learning or change how it's learning, brings in reproducibility issues as well. But anyway, I think this is a really interesting aspect. And obviously, because they learn and interact, they also adapt as they act and interact. So it's dynamic and relational on both sides, I think. And so this is really where I'm kind of thinking about, okay, so how are 1 and 2 coming together or not coming together? I think when we start thinking about automation or AI in science in this kind of automation plus setting, one aspect is that the opacity problem becomes more multidimensional or changes shape. And I think that new system level epistemic challenges emerge, that the more streamlined, simpler framing that work for specific cases might not even be able to see in that sense. For instance, I think opacity, people thinking about human automation interaction, they also emphasize basically a reverse opacity problem. Is the human opaque to the machine? There's also a focus on system relations and dynamics that comes in. So for instance, worries about the de-skilling of the researcher that's sitting there, and what does that do to the epistemic process of research? For instance, our ability to detect errors. There's often a narrative in there in this automation process, like you'll still do the true science and the hard thinking, just give like mere manual labor away. So there's a risk of de-skilling, but I'm cautious about whether these kind of mere manual labors steps are really that near, whether there's more, whether they're epistemically more significant. I think there's also a question here about outskilling of the researchers, meaning that once, and people are starting to do that, because as you can see here, this uses systems that are built for humans, and like sometimes they use human pipettes, and you can see like the robot really awkwardly like using those pipettes. Obviously, people are starting to develop systems that are optimized for machine use. But again, I think if it's something that the human cannot really use or kind of has experience with, that might also bring in different dark spots that might be problematic if you want, for instance, to troubleshoot the process or system. And another point is kind of how system level learning looks like. There's a speed differential between the learners, and learning to me here, really the point is like learning from error, science as erring, kind of as making errors and moving on and learning from that. How is that learning really working when we have these two systems working together? Yeah, and there are other issues, but I don't have time to look at that. But I think also one thing that becomes very clear here is a team focus. And you can find this going back decades and more, where people have reflected on this. So Johnson et al. Here, we believe that increased effectiveness of such human agent teamwork hinges not merely on trying to make machines more independent through their autonomy, but also in striving to make them better team players by making them more capable, sophisticated, interdependent, joint activity with people. These are people who usually think about autonomous weapon systems and self-driving cars, but I do think it applies to the research context as well. So anyway, how many time? Like 2 or 3 minutes? 5 minutes, wow, okay, I don't really need that. But just a quick point on how should we move forward. And again, this is all very preliminary work, and I hope it makes sense so far. But I think some of my conclusions are that I think an atomistic iframe works well for some uses of AI in science, especially something like AlphaFold. But for cases of automation plus that I looked at, the optimistic iframe I think starts to crumble and becomes less, becomes more limited. I think Clark and Khosrovi make a similar point about discovering with AI when they stress the collective-centered view over an agent-centered view. I think there are resonances there. And I think when we make that move to automation plus, opacity becomes only one problem among many. And you know, it's still a central issue. I'm not saying it's like an issue you should consider. It becomes more dimensional and all that. And I think a relation system framework is better suited for considering these new forms of automation that we observe. And just quickly, where can we find starting points for such a framework? I think there's a lot of fascinating research that goes back decades on human automation team research. And so Micah Ensley, she was chief scientific officer of the US Air Force. Like what a cool job. And she's like reflecting a lot on automated weapon systems. But you can see here, performance is at the top. Bias is still there, transparency and explainability, all of that is in there. But for instance, there are issues like team situation awareness. And obviously, this is, if you go into the theater of war, like I need to know what the other is doing. But I do think these kind of terminologies could be really helpful to think through the laboratory as an automated space. There's interesting work, in this case by Nello Cristianini and James Ladyman at Bristol and Bath, that like think about different kind of uses of AI in society, but they talk about social machines, where a machine is like an apparatus composed of parts that does a particular type of work, and then a social machine is where one of the parts are human beings. They have like these comments like the seat of intelligence is not in the algorithm or the human, but just think this is very generative and interesting. I'm not kind of committing to any of these. And then we also have Nancy Nersessian's work on the laboratory as a distributed cognitive system. I think in all these resources, there's interesting work already out there, but I think it will need to be mobilized more. Yeah, and I think it's happening in practice. So this is a recent paper, 2023, group in Oxford. They want to move, so they look at actually Bayesian optimization, which is what Maholo LabDroid and other systems are using now. And they don't just want explainable Bayesian optimization, but collaborative and explainable. And I think they really want to move beyond like just human-centered AI. I think they really want to kind of, they talk about building a balanced human partnership. And so I think this is happening, but to understand where this might have to go or where this might not be enough, or what, I think we need a more thorough analysis of the challenges that in such a relational system level problem comes up. So yeah, just to wrap up, automation, rapidly growing and changing, machine learning, key player, but it's a weird amalgam of different things that come together that really matter as well. I think it is a significant break in how science learns about the world. I think if you want to study this, it will be good to move to a relational S-frame, and there's several starting points there. That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to say thank you for your attention.